Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Sangeeta Berde. I am one of the co-founders of Organization for Rare Disease India. And at the outset, let me welcome all of you to the inaugural Care for Rare webinar series, which is initiated by ORDI. As many of you know, friends, that ORDI has been working in the area of rare diseases for the past 7 years. And even before that, there were people who are associated with the rare diseases have been working in the area, like Prasanna has been working for a very long time in the rare disease area. So coming really to all the rare diseases of patients and the caregivers who have been taking care of themselves and their caregivers who have been indulging really tirelessly taking care of the rare disease patients. So we have been, as ORDI, you know that we have been working in the area of diagnosis, treatment, management, and policy decisions. But this isn't really possible if you really ask me that is it possible to do things on your own? No, frankly not. While ORDI started as an organization, as a representation of all the rare diseases in India, but it is humongous task to look at in the area of diagnosis, treatment, and management and policy when it comes to rare disease. We can't do this thing single-handedly. We have to have support of many people, and we are really, really thankful that we are supported by many healthcare providers, many policymakers, many of our patient advocacy organizations who are our friends, our long-time partners, and who are who have been supporting us a lot in terms of really taking this whole task of rare diseases forward. I'm very, very happy that we are a part of this whole community and doing this all together. I think that is what I personally believe in, and that is one of the credo even of ORDI. In addition to what we do as as our task or as our advocacy efforts in diagnosis, treatment, management, and policy, we feel that we also have a responsibility to drive education in the area of rare diseases. And that is the reason that we decided and we thought that we must start something in this area. How can we bring in, how can we connect our rare disease community? How can we connect healthcare providers? How can we connect patients? How can we connect policymakers? And that's why we felt that is there a way to do that? And that's how the Care for Rare webinar series really took off. And this I'm very, very happy to tell you that this is the first of its kind rare disease webinar that we are starting with the name Care for Rare, and that is something which is going to take care of many, many aspects in terms of diagnosis, treatment, and management. And this is the first inaugural session, friends, and we are going to address a very, very important topic said called rare diseases in India. Where are we now really? Okay, and I cannot think of a better name. Let me tell you, I cannot think of a better name or a better person than one person whom I know right from the day one when I started working in the rare disease area, and that is Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt. I'm very, very happy to really, that she accepted this very graciously to deliver this session, which is the first session on rare diseases in India. Where are we now? And I think Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt really doesn't need an introduction. I always, whenever I meet her, I feel so much of warmth when I talk to her, and so much of positive vibe. And I'm sure a similar kind of a vibe she gives to her patients and people whom she is in contact with. But yes, I need to introduce her in a little formal manner. So let me talk about Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt a little bit more. So Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt, she's a consultant in clinical genetics. She is working tirelessly in the rare disease area since the year 2006. Yeah, that is the time probably many of us, at least I had not thought about rare disease as my personal calling in terms of doing something in this area. So she's been there for a long time. She is a part of an expert group who drafted one of the first rare disease policies in this country. And I would say that was a breakthrough. I certainly remember the time when all of them were working tirelessly to talk about this policy and getting it approved by the Karnataka government. And that is where Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt really put her positive foot, and she really expressed her thoughts very well, and it has been one of the very, very game-changing scenario when it came to rare disease treatment in this country. She's also involved in many activities providing the complete set of clinical genetic services with her efforts and support. So, which is again very important for driving a particular category of the disease, which are very unknown, which people hardly talk about, which country hardly knows about. And where one particular government which started it, and it made all the difference, and that is Karnataka government. So that's very important as far as we as a rare disease community is concerned. He's also instrumental in setting up Super Science Center of Excellence for Rare Disease Patients in IGICH with three partners. And we're very proud of this initiative, which ORDA has been part of it and as a part of three partners. So our third partner is, of course, CHG in this. And this is a seven-bed daycare center which provides treatment for MSDs and PIDs. And this is India's first exclusive daycare center for the rare diseases, friends. And what else? I think she is a doctor par excellence. What I would say, I really don't want to get into her biodata because it will be very long with what I know. But I know her as a person, and I feel that she is more than a doctor. She's a guide, a mentor to organization for rare disease, and she is truly a guardian angel for 27,000 families in Karnataka and India who come to meet her, get kids treated from her, who get a patient managed from her, who her family go and talk to
known eventually will be probably prevalence of a disease that has less than 1 in 5,000 eventually. But as yet, we do not have any numbers. So projecting from the total numbers that are known worldwide, it is estimated that there are 350 million patients globally with one of the 7,000 rare diseases, and an estimated one of that's 70 million patients or more than that who may be in India. So India has the third largest rare disease population, which accounts for more than the population of the whole of Thailand. From the 7,000 known rare diseases, 80% of these have an identifiable genetic origin. And as a clinical geneticist, this is where it becomes important to have my own play of role in this whole journey. And I'm really grateful that we have been able to make small changes. It needs many, many more changes, as you'll see along the top. Now, 70% of these rare diseases start in childhood, and they have a huge impact as the child grows up. Less than 500 of these diseases, that's less than 5% of them, actually have a treatment. And according to the WHO, it is estimated that 1 in 15 individuals may have one or more rare disease. So these are some of the facts. And where we come to what it does to children, rare diseases are probably accounting for about 35% of all deaths within the first year of life. I think many of these deaths, as long as we recognize these illnesses in time, could be prevented. And again, according to the WHO, when the infant mortality rate of a country or a community comes down to below 30 per thousand, then rare diseases and genetic disorders should take a priority in the public health planning of that state. I think we have reached that. In Karnataka particularly, we've got 28 per thousand population, per thousand live births infant mortality rate. And I think that is where we are progressing to. So we cannot continue to ignore rare diseases as a group and keep focusing only on infectious diseases and the like. Now, what are the issues that we have in reaching out to the majority of the population? I said that our population was 1.3 billion. This is this astronomical figure which accounts for 18% of the population of the whole world. And we have nearly 26 million births per year. Now, this is the highest number of births anywhere in the world, one country. And what's important is that we do not have any sort of a state-mandated universal newborn screening program to look out for diseases that is prioritized for that state. As I mentioned, health is a state subject, and with 29 different states and 7 union territories, we have thousands of dialects but 15 official languages. Why does this become important? Whatever you try to communicate to anybody, whether it's by means of genetic counseling, or whether you have got any literature that you want to spread around, or even any information or teaching programs that you're going to spread, you need to think of it in many, many languages so that it reaches out to everybody. Added to the problems of actually having diseases, we have high levels of consanguinity in certain pockets of the country, and plenty of it in southern parts of India. Karnataka as a state has got 30% consanguinity rate. What we mean by consanguinity is marriage within very close blood relatives, either uncle, niece, first cousins, or second cousins. And what this leads to is that both parents could be carriers of recessive disorders, which may then manifest in one and more children that they have. There is low awareness both within the medical community and within the general population as such about rare diseases, so it doesn't come to the notice of medical facility early. And then, of course, everything else that goes alongside it. There's less accessibility or availability of resources. The cost of genetic disease and therapies have to be borne by patients. The diagnosis itself has to be paid in most places by patient families, and sustainability of any sort of therapy is difficult. Where the health budget of India is concerned, it still accounts for about 2% of the GDP. And unless this raises itself, we are never going to get to the point where we can reach out equitably to everybody. Now, to be diagnosed with a genetic disorder, you need a specialist who is able to make the first evaluation and also do the sustained management of a patient family. Now, this is just to highlight how many genetic centers we have with full counseling facilities throughout the country. And literally, there's less than a dozen places. It is, according to medical literature, noted that there must be about 30 centers, but these are not all comprehensive. So with 30 centers taking care of 1.3 billion population, you can see where we stand today and now. So the centers for training are the people who are going to provide new specialists to different parts of India. And again, these are concentrated in big cities, and with 1 or 2 trainees per training program, we produce less than about 20 people per year that are qualified to look at genetic disorders and evaluate families and do the necessary testing and take over the treatment where it's available. So these are major struggles for those centers that are functioning, and also to have teachers to do the training, conduct the training programs where it is necessary. So these are the most updated numbers in different centers. Now, this was one picture that we had taken in 2014. I think it's still relevant, of the majority of consultants in clinical genetics and medical genetics throughout the country, and they can all fit onto a single stage picture. So these are the number of people that actually look after most of the services that are happening throughout the country. Some centers have got specialization in specific disorders. Some centers have to look at most disorders that occur in a general clinic, but we have not yet reached the levels of developed countries where you can have subspecializations like cancer genetics or hematogenetics or hearing loss clinics or specifications. All of us have to do everything wherever we are. Now, within that framework of whatever shared information exists, this list of common diseases that are mostly seen, we've been talking about 7,000 different disorders, all accounting for rare diseases. But if you look at those that are most frequent, they come into a group of about 10 or 11 groups. Chromosome disorders with Down syndrome are definitely top on the list. Inherited hearing loss syndromes and genetic eye disorders also feature right on the top with 1 in 500 incidents. And then you have congenital defects, of which the most important is congenital heart defects. And for this, only 1 in 10 children who are diagnosed with this achieve surgery to correct the heart problem. Hematological disorders like beta thalassemia, sickle cell, and hemophilia, fortunately, or in large numbers in this country, are still being looked after by separate categories of blood-related special cells that fund some of the therapies and some of the management with diagnosis. Now, disorders of intellectual issues, which is what really troubles families, are a growing group, and so also neuromuscular disorders. Last 5 categories, the lysosomal storage disorders, the inborn errors of metabolism, some of the skeletal dysplasias, the primary immune deficiencies, and these neuromuscular disorders are actually on the threshold of treatment, and some of these have got treatments that are today available for patients. And that's why it's important to highlight that you can do something in the groups and categories that are frequently seen in many genetic centers. Now, there are no numbers. And very early on in 2002, there was a very nice paper which projected the international frequency of how often these disorders occur in specific diseases. For example, India produces about 10,000 new thalassemics per year. We probably have an estimated 5 lakh people with congenital malformations being born every year. And these are just Western projected numbers. We really don't know what the numbers are because there is no systematic collection of the data right through the country as yet. And this becomes a huge problem when you're planning a funded policy nationally to address these issues. Now, I'm going to just give you an example of 3 disorders to highlight what I want to say about these rare diseases. So by the estimation projected from outside of 1 in 40,000 incidents, we think that there must be 33,000 new births per year of a rare metabolic disease called Gaucher disease. And this is how we see our children. By the time they're about 2 years old and they arrive in clinic, they have vastly distended abdomens and they have enlarged spleen and liver, lots of blood complications with low platelet counts, low hemoglobin values, and majority of them can not eat because of mechanical reasons and they have growth failure. This is when we need to intervene because unlike the Western population Gaucher disease, who present much later in the 2nd or 3rd decade, our children present very, very early because of different gene mutations. What do we do in most of the centers? We make a clinical assessment of all these general features and then decide what we need to test for. The first step in testing is usually a dry blood spot where you do the enzyme values of the missing enzyme and look at the biomarkers to see if it's elevated. When there is some confirmation at that level, you do a DNA testing. What happens after that? You need to think about the definitive therapy. Now, definitive therapy for Gaucher's disease and another half a dozen genetic disorders called lysosomal storage disorders is enzyme replacement therapy. So if you have a missing enzyme in the body, you inject it from outside. It's usually given as an infusion, either weekly or 2 weekly, depending on what the disorder is. This therapy is lifelong, it is desperately expensive, and it is imported from companies from outside. You can see how difficult it must be to get to this. And in the last 10 or 12 years, we have only managed to get about 180 patients in the whole country onto therapies for all the disorders that can be treated. 160 patients throughout the country are on free access because of the charitable programs of the companies that produce them. And about 20, and this number is now slowly growing, is of patients who have now been compensated for by their companies or reimbursed by various governmental programs. So in a country where I think that there must be thousands of patients who require specific treatment for specific disorders, this is just one example to say how difficult it has been to get the right treatment for the right disorder just because it's expensive and needs to be given for a long period of time. Now, other things are also there. So in the acute metabolic disorders, these are also disorders in which an enzyme may be missing from the body, and therefore the signs and symptoms of the disorder appear very, very early in life, usually within the first few days. There are a huge group of these diseases, but the most common of them is phenylketonuria or PKU. What happens in these disorders is a specific part of the diet accumulates in the body and is toxic as the child is growing up. So they have problems with their intellect as they start growing up, and they can manifest with things like seizures. And if it is not treated in the early days, there's an irreversible change affecting the neurology in each of these disorders. The treatment for most of these were diets, specific diets which eliminated the compound that the patient did not have to have within their own diet and still allow growth to be appropriate. Now, at about 16,000 rupees a tin, approximately, of a 400-gram tin, and for a 3 kg child requiring approximately 3 tins in a month, you can estimate what the cost of these imported food products would have been. In the last 8 or 9 years, in Bangalore itself, with a very small company that is locally producing other food products, we have managed to partner with them from Center for Human Genetics and make foods for various disorders in this category. The, these tins possibly cost about a tenth of what it would cost from abroad. And our children, and the graph below is showing you how the values of the toxic compounds, in this case phenylalanine levels, can come down completely to baseline being on the appropriate diet if it is started early. We measure these values periodic intervals, and now that our children are growing up, it's important for them to graduate from these milk powder tins to something that they can take to school in the school dabbas. So more recently, we have started with them with flour, which can be made into various food products, as well as biscuits. And the list is endless. And I think each of these is a struggle because it needs approval from the FSSAI and other national bodies that allow us to give this to patients without compromising on their safety. But indigenous therapy development is going to be the rule of the future to get more patients onto therapy. We also see a particular type of lysosomal storage disorder called glycogen storage disorder, in which starch, which is uncooked in nature, which sustained release of glucose requires to be given. Again, this is another example of what the company produces and what we are able to share with our patients and get them to grow up as normal individuals, but consuming these special food products. So for 14 different metabolic disorders, we have been able to get these products distributed throughout the country. Now let us look at another disorder, hearing loss. Even within the medical community, majority of people who see children with early onset hearing loss in both ears leading to complete deafness do not realize that this can be a genetic disorder. 80% of these children actually have a single gene that is responsible for hearing loss. And if hearing loss starts under 2 years of age and is severe, then it leads to non-development of speech. And this is what used to be called loosely deaf and dumb community. So if you identify hearing loss early on and then intervene quite early, many of these children do not or may not completely respond to having just hearing aids put in, and they may require specific surgery, including cochlear implantation followed by speech therapy. Now, these people can regain complete hearing and, if treated early, complete speech. So otherwise, they are of normal intelligence. And you can see how much of a difference it would make if we had a newborn screening for hearing, which is available in certain hospitals and in certain states. So I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we can do easily where intelligence is otherwise not compromised in these individuals. Now, what has happened from the information that we have already garnered from all these 20 or 30 centers that are practicing genetics have together put forth publications about the profile, the genetic causes, and the specific things that we see in scientific publications. Now, this is part of the story because when you know the underlying science, then you can develop therapies, because it's not just yet another medicine that's made ad hoc, but it is addressed towards the genetic underlying cause of many of these diseases. But medical people cannot do things by themselves. Ultimately, it's the voice of the community. The families that individually cannot do everything because they're themselves preoccupied looking after the everyday needs of their children. So what has happened is that we have had a lot of individual and group-wise voices, and this has led to the formation many support groups. We still need much more. Many of these support groups have been started by individual parents of people of those diseases. But what we really require is a much larger voice, not just focusing on achieving individual treatment for their own children, but really making a difference to society and the way society deals with it. A very good example of this is what has been happening in Taiwan, who have a real strong community and network of rare disease patients, and how the government listens to them. Why I have put ORDI right at the top is that even with my own communication over the years with this whole team, they have been an umbrella organization and in achieving I think, comprehensive communication with families, whether it is special clinics, whether it is reaching out to individual families, whether it's having a helpline, whether it's raising awareness through the Race for Seven. And that's a picture of one of the Race for Sevens where thousands of people gather for an early morning run to raise awareness, one for each disease. And this time, the last time, it was held in 10 cities in India, besides other places abroad. So all this has been organized by the Organization of Rare Diseases. And many of the specific disease support groups also take support from ORDI. Now, public awareness is key, and whether it's in English or it's in the regional languages, unless you're in the news on a sustained basis, there are two things that get achieved. When we go to government on various counts, they say, but where is this problem? We don't see it anywhere, we don't hear about it. So you need to go to the press and be in the news on regular basis. The second thing is, for other families who might be in very remote places or don't have access to a diagnosis, by seeing information about rare diseases in the vernacular or in the English press, it becomes easier for them to get in touch and think about these possible diagnosis and ask about it from their own medical teams, and then get the right tests done so that they can achieve diagnosis. So I think we have been doing this on a continuous basis, and I need to do much, much more of public awareness. So what's really special about what's happened in Karnataka? I think we've been really, really lucky, because within the government framework, there have been people that have been educated enough to listen to us and be sympathetic to the cause. Secondly, our medical fraternity, however small it is, has been united in thinking about the patients first and trying to do the best within a government setting without burdening the patients with additional costs. And of course, all this would not be possible if we did not have such a strong voice from the public voices. That is usually the most key driving factor into making the changes that is required. So there are many such gatherings that we have had, but in particular, I wanted to talk about the International Rare Diseases Day on February 28th in 2014, when Bangalore hosted it. And very surprisingly, we had 900 families that came through from all parts of the country. Each of these families had one or more children with rare diseases. And the theme was "Our Life Also Counts." And I think that is the theme for most of us right through life, because if we can make a difference and give respect to the life that these children lead, to become useful and societally important adults, I think we would have achieved what we need to achieve in life. So sometimes the voices of everybody, whether it's the medical fraternity or the individual families, is not easily heard. And there was a time when the families had to resort to public interest litigation. And 35 families went to court at a point and won the case through this to achieve therapy for lysosomal storage disorders. Only a fraction of the money was sanctioned, and this was in 2016. And I share with you this document of the first 1 crore rupees that came through. The money was not as big as it was required, but this was the first foot in the door, the first time ever in the country that the government funded treatment of a rare disease. And this is certainly the precedence of all the treatments that has happened subsequently. And we're very lucky that we are about 3 or 4 years down the line where government is continuously funding, with some hiccups, of course, but we are getting funding for some of the rare diseases that need to get regular treatment and continuous treatment. Once we started getting money for treatment, we realized that regular wards and regular nursing staff and, for these families who come in on a repeated basis, we needed a place where you could give them treatment, because each of these therapies is costly and requires to be given in the right way with the cold chain maintained. And as Sangeeta said in her introduction, we set up in partnership ORDI, the hospital itself, Indira Gandhi Institute of Child Health, and Center for Human Genetics, to which I belong, together put together this Center of Excellence for Rare Diseases, which is a 7-bedded daycare unit. And as you can see, it's really posh. It's really designed to be friendly to the child. And many of the children now, the older children, just walk confidently with their dosages and talk to the nurse on hand. And we have a dedicated nurse and data entry operators to keep all the data. And approximately 120 infusions are given every month, completely free of cost. The patient pays for nothing, even if they can afford it. What I have put on the right side is a young boy, the first government funded child who got onto therapy in 2016, whose father committed suicide while he was waiting for his child's therapy. And this is the only born to his own parents. So we felt that we had a responsibility towards this family. And this is one, he's now 7.5 years old, doing extremely well. So this model of having a rare diseases therapy center has now been seen and copied by a few other centers throughout the country. And I think we need many more such dedicated centers, both for the patients and also for the doctors and the medical staff to gain expertise on what we are doing and how we are doing it right. What can you do in the meantime when you are looking at families that may have babies again who might be affected? Sometimes the best way is to see if you can prevent such things or at least make an early diagnosis. So prenatal diagnosis is a method of testing for pregnancies early on from the 12th week onwards so that you can identify a recurrent illness within the family, especially if it is of a genetic origin, by methods that are called Coriolan-Willis sampling, which is done from 11 weeks onwards of pregnancy, and amniocentesis, which is done from 16 weeks onwards. These are done from trained centers by trained specialists, and they're still confined to the larger cities because it needs a lot of team expertise to get about this. Once the sample is taken from around the baby, or around the growing baby, it needs to go to the right genetic center for genetic tests to find the answer. Either the baby will be affected or it won't be affected. Either way, it gives the parents some control about what they wish to do in the future and how to manage the child when it's born immediately so that treatment can be given early on, or if it is a devastating illness, to stop the pregnancy within the limits of the government laws. Now, what else can be done to prevent or make early diagnosis? I think one of the key things that we really lack and we need to work towards is universal newborn screening. What does this mean? You usually have babies that are either delivered at home or in the hospital to get 3 or 4 drops of blood onto filter paper of a defined dimension to be collected and air dried. From these 3 or 4 drops of blood, it can be sent, this filter paper, which is the size of a postcard, can be sent to a centralized laboratory where anything from 3, 4, 6, or up to 60 disorders, which are rare and treatable, can be checked for. The entire process takes about 24 hours. And if you have something that is a high risk, it's repeated again with confirmatory tests. And if you establish an early onset disorder, even in families that didn't have it before in the family history, there is a mechanism to start treatment early on. So obviously this is done for disorders that have a defined treatment. And while this has been available in countries like New Zealand and the UK from 1965 and 1970, we do not have it yet for every child that is born in the country, although there are some centers and some states that have taken the right step forward for some of these. But newborn screening probably is one of the most successful public health initiatives worldwide, and especially for rare disorders. Now, what is the government doing at a national level? In April 2017, the felt need of having registries, of having accurate numbers, was first taken up seriously. And through the Indian Council of Medical Research, a platform for a registry of rare diseases has been set up. At the outset, there will be about a dozen diseases that are accounted for, and data from all the centers that see these rare diseases will feed into it. Obviously, the compromise is that this is a hospital-based registry and not a community-based registry. But eventually, we'll get numbers from the community, and we will get more accurate numbers for those disorders for which we can actually go back to the government and design programs that are effective and have the right sort of volumes of funding because the numbers are known. Now, where are we today? the most important thing that we need to do is have something universal. And the only universal thing that you can do is have a rare disease policy. Some of the developed countries, the US, the European Union, as it's disintegrating, as well as Japan, have, even Brazil for that matter, have got their rare disease policy, within the framework of which, whether it's prevention, newborn screening, prenatal diagnosis, getting the numbers, identification of diseases from with a hub and spoke pattern, or it is achieving therapy, all these come under the umbrella of how it's done. And I think that there was no other way that it could have been done by any individual, considering how expensive treatments have been. So what has changed for us is a draft policy with many hiccups. There was a policy that came out in 2018, which then was withdrawn in between. And in 2020, just at the beginning of the year, the draft National Rare Disease Policy, a document was put forth and out for public comments. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 crisis has put a delay through this whole thing. But eventually, in its original draft, it may not be the most ideal document, but without a document, we cannot make a better forward step on it. So what has changed over the time that has led to the formation of this? I put the picture of Supreme Court because an individual family with Gaucher disease, where the father was a rickshaw puller in Delhi, went to demanding therapy for his child. And among other things, the court also mandated that there should be the formation of this rare disease policy. And this long journey from there till here has led to the formation of this rare disease policy. There are many criticisms, but I think we have started on the right step. So there has been increased awareness about rare diseases in the last 10 or 12 years, thanks to a whole bunch of people, but we need many, many more people to be joining this whole group. There is availability of diagnostics, especially the next generation sequencing, which is becoming more affordable. So rare, the really rare, the ultra rare diseases, not the common groups, can also be diagnosed effectively. Funding for rare diseases for certain areas, such as the LSD task forces, which set up testing in various centers for LSDs, was started by government agencies. There is a slowly increasing number of experts through the country, but there are many, many more that are required. There are parent support groups that are becoming more and more effective in achieving the ear of the government. There are court cases and public litigations, which are the last desperate step where families are concerned to get the attention of the government. The state government initiatives, especially in the state that I come from, the therapies that are now becoming available, especially indigenous therapies, and all this will come under the rare diseases policy. But to make it more inclusive, we all need to work towards it. So what do I feel that needs to be done? I feel that newborn screening for early identification of disorders is a must. We do need more specialists, and by specialists I do not mean doctors itself. We need genetic counselors, we need more programs to train genetic counselors. Communication is the key for all these rare diseases, because many doctors also do not know the meaning and the extent of how a disease even affects an entire family and other relatives, even the caregivers of these diseases. So the spread of expertise, and in many, many languages throughout the country, needs to be effective. Early definitive treatment where one exists. It's no point giving a treatment into the second decade when the child required it in the first 2 years of life. So we need to get there in the right time. And where no definitive treatment exists, you can't just send them home without doing anything. You need to give supportive therapy to see that the well-being of the child, whether it's mobility, whether it's education, or whether it's just maintaining the health to the best we can without specific therapies continued. I think I can't stress enough that inclusive education in our society, one big drawback is that we are curious individuals. We don't think much about asking somebody directly on the road, what does your child have? And also when it comes to education, we're not very good about including other children with physical or intellectual disabilities into mainstream education. Many parents feel the big difficulty of having transport to education as one of the major hindrances on how to get there, because specific schools may be very far away or very difficult to access because of the disability of the child. The role of the support groups will not be only to achieve the specific treatment for the disease that they stand for, but is also for sustained awareness for advocacy even at a government level, and very importantly, eventually fundraising. Fundraising not just for more therapies, but also to encourage good research, which leads to clinical research that leads to therapies. Because this is a partnership, there is a partnership between all groups, all interested groups in this. So good partnership between basic medical research and medicine to develop low cost, easy access treatments cannot be understated. And for all these things, eventually funding will have to come from governmental and societal support. Only then will we have this utopia where we can have patients under therapy. So I will stop here, and I have a picture here of a group of 17 patients or 17 affected children who are now growing up with Gaucher disease, and each of these is on therapy. And you can see how good they look. They all came to celebrate a day of Gaucher awareness. And I don't want us to have only 17 patients in a group photograph. Every child, every adult that has a rare disease and where there is a therapy achievable, we need to get to that point. And I think that's the start point of this series of lectures. And hopefully in the end, we will have many, many more happy faces and pictures. Thank you. So, Mr. Shirut.
Yeah. Can we have you, can you switch on your camera?
I'm trying to, yes.
Okay, can we have some question and answer session if the audience wants to ask you questions? Madam,
can I ask a question, please?
Yes, please do.
Okay, ma'am, you mentioned about neurodevelopmental diseases, are increasing, or is it diagnosis is increasing? I mean, the diagnosis is leading to a larger number.
I could not hear the question. Can you repeat it for me?
Ma'am, my question is, you mentioned about neurodevelopmental diseases being on the rise. Diseases like Fragile X and Rett syndrome. My question, is this increase due to better diagnosis, or is it due to the numbers increasing per se? That's my first.
If I have
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. And
Okay.
I think not just Fragile X and other intellectual disorders. I think at the outset, we are diagnosing them more accurately because of the better availability of tests. I'm not sure that the numbers per se are increasing.
Okay. My second question is related to research for therapies. What do you think is where is the stumble block? I mean, why is research not happening the way it's happening in the West, in India? What is holding things back here in India?
So I think that would be the topic of an entire talk, but I think the key steps over here is really when you look at research, there is research happening, basic research. The translation of that research coming into a clinical research modality and then going out to industry is a little bit more restricted. First, because we don't have numbers. So if somebody is going to develop a therapy, they need to know what numbers of patients there are. And tomorrow the market will need to know what sort of a business model to make it around. So everything starts with numbers. And then, of course, funding. These are the two key things. The simplistically put, these are the two key things that are coming in the way.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ma'am, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Ma'am, what do you think? What is your opinion? You said that there are very few centers across India that are experts in diagnosing these diseases. So there are many people who are in corners of country and they have to come to these centers. So if the pediatrician, the first in line pediatrician, can he connect with you over a medicine platform and get that kind of support using some software in place? What is your opinion on that, ma'am?
So I'm glad you're asking this question now, because with so much of lockdown, we've been forced to do telemedicine clinics. And we certainly feel that it's a doable thing. And wherever in the country you are, whether, what we try and do best is everybody doesn't need to connect with me or one center. So there is a distribution of centers, and many times when somebody writes to me from, say, Delhi or somewhere around Delhi, I would refer them to a center, a colleague's place in Delhi. I'm just giving you an example. But telemedicine is certainly one way for somebody who's in a remote place, whether it's the medical person or the patient family directly, they can get in touch with us, and should be able to definitely at least advise on the basic things that the family requires.
Ma'am, I'll write to you separately on this. Actually, we are collaborating with CDAC on implementing this telegenetics platform with some specific hospitals and with specific experts. So I will reach out to you, ma'am. I'm from Genetico. We've had a couple of meetings over conferences. Great presentation, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for my question.
Thank you so much.
Anybody else? We'll take the last question.
There's somebody in the chat. They said, what do you think are the two key challenges in making the policy come into force and how to mitigate it? I think the policy will come into force. I don't think that it is going to be, I think the journey has started. To make the policy effective will require input from all of us, really, because at the moment we are focusing on getting as many people diagnosed and treated, because that's the priority at this moment. But it will have to have a wider umbrella in which we will need to do. So if I had to say one thing at the end of this talk, I would say that you need many, many Mr. Shirols. You can't have one person taking the burden of pushing and walking to every office and standing in dharna outside every government institution. I think we need many more people who need to actively contribute their time. That is very, very important to make this sustained process. You can't sit at home and expect things to change overnight. Many times I get asked by patient families, why is nobody doing anything? Who is the nobody or the anybody? It's all of us. So unless we do it together, nothing is going to really work. So for any policy to be working, it has to be us. Would you agree, Mr. Shiro?
Yes, definitely. Your words are the golden words.
Okay. Any more questions?
There's one more question in the chat, Dr. Meenakshi.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that,
What is your recommendation for industry to help these patients in such a way that it is sustainable for the industry as well?
So, yes, the answer to what is the role of industry, I think one good thing is for any industry to think about manufacturing or for selling medication that is required for a small group of a specific rare disease. There are many challenges in developing these medicines. There's the cost of developing it, and then the marketing to a very small market. To make it feasible, the government has to take a role. And one of the things that the governments have done under the orphan drug policies of their countries is to give some sort of incentives. Some of it is tax incentives, some is market exclusivity. There are some things, and we are very fortunate that in 2019, March, there has been a document from the government of India that has put some of these incentives out to companies. They're not completely universal, but the thing is that both for clinical trials in rare diseases and for manufacture, there are some forward steps. So industry can take advantage of this and partner with medical facilities that actually see rare diseases to understand it better.
Now I request Dr. Rashid Marquand, a senior doctor who is on the call, who wants to comment. Dr. Rashid, please.
Yeah, hi. That was an absolutely an excellent, lecture. I have comments, not questions.
Yes.
And Meenakshi,
Yes.
of
Doctor.
of course, newborn screening is needed. And
Mhm.
yes, of course, more geneticists are needed. But
Mhm.
my sincere request is that the genetic community keep the practicing pediatrician in the loop. For heaven's sake, this knowledge cannot be cloistered in the genetic group itself. It has to be spread. One, and two, nothing can be achieved unless we get the OBG community sensitized. Let me just end by saying that when I started medical school 57 years ago, all I knew was genetics consisted of Bertrand bar bodies, you know, and today, just because of my own interest, I have actually learned right up to, attending meetings with y'all and being part of the genetic groups. I've learned even something up to the extent of CRISPR-Cas9. But that is not what is needed. The future of medicine is genetics, immunogenetics, and unless RD and communities like this spread this across to the general pediatric and obstetric community, we will still be talking within ourselves. This is just a comment. Sorry for the critical comment.
So thank you, Dr. Merchant. I don't see that as a criticism. First of all, I'd like you to know at one point in time you were my teacher. So
Oh,
in Bombay. So I have to say,
really?
yes. So I I have to tell you that most of us who are geneticists, clinical geneticists, are pediatricians first. So many of us have started in pediatrics. There cannot be an ability to exclude pediatrics because there are not enough in geneticists, and I think it is because most of these people are children. It has to be with the support. So it's not geneticists alone that can manage the volume of disorders. So pediatricians, in fact, how we look at it is pediatricians, neurologists, preferably pediatric neurologists, ophthalmologists, hearing specialists are key, and of course OBG, especially fetal medicine, have to be one team in the management. This is not an exclusive small select ivory tower group. So I take it in the right way. And I think the only role that the geneticist plays over and above what general pediatrics can do is coordinating and keeping sustained, group movement where it concerns the single individual family. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. Point is well taken. Your point is well taken. I just wish more pediatricians are roped into all your genetic meetings. And I'm one of the few who does general pediatrics. And over the last 5 years, I've completely got sold onto the concept of genetics. I mean, everything I look at seems to be genetic. I mean, I look around and I see genetics right all over. And I'm wondering what for the earlier 40 years of my practice, what happened. Of course, we knew it was there, but unfortunately, we didn't have the means to diagnose and get therapeutics. So
So I'm
sorry for
very
the but
glad
that's an
to
old
hear
timers comment.
that. So I wanted to let you know on this note that we run a fellowship course in pediatric genetics for pediatricians, which is completely practical under the aegis of the health university in the state. And this is a one-year course. So if you have any young people under you that want to join this course, I would welcome any trainees that want to come in from Bombay.
Yeah, thank you, Meenakshi. That is so nice. Thank you. I am most obliged, and really,
Yes.
I am so impressed with the whole subject of genetics that whatever time I have left in years, I hope to dedicate and teach as much as I can. I'm trying to set up a small center at Nanavati Hospital, and we have got actually a couple of geneticists put together, and we are doing a little bit of stuff, as you may know.
Yes,
Thank
mostly.
you,
That's
thank
really,
you, thank you, Prasanna.
thank you.
So thank you, sir. So we have little over 2 minutes. I think we wanted to end it in time. There are certain questions coming in the chat. So I'll send those questions to you separately, Dr. Bhatt. You can try answering them and then post it to the groups. That's what our objective is. Uh, so I thank you for the wonderful presentation as usual. And you never said no to our request and our parents' request whenever you are called. You are always obliged. without any hesitation, without a second thought. So thanks for your making this inaugural session very successful. I think it went on very well and well
Can I
attended.
make
Some of
can
the
I make
people.
a comment? Prasanna, can I make a comment?
Yes, sir.
Final one. Can I make a half a minute comment?
Yes, sir. Please.
Okay, so I remember this was in early 1967, 68, and I was taking rounds with my boss as a young resident, and a child with arthritis walked in, and I remembered my boss telling me, "Look, this child has got. Look at this child's nose. It's looking a little sort of discolored. Look at his ears. They're looking little discolored. Will you collect his urine and keep it out in the sun?" And lo and behold, it turned out to be an alkaptonuria. So the first one which Garrett, the first inborn error which Garrett had described, and a keen physician like my boss, you know, picked it up with an arthritic child with a little blackish colored nose and ear and little arthritic changes, and we had a diagnosis of alkaptonuria. So for heaven's sake, not to forget with all NGS and everything around, and microarrays around, the simple importance of a good clinician around.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So,
Thank you very much. I guess that's the end of the meeting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Shall we stop here?
yeah, in fact, yesterday we had received more than 200 registration, but I see overall participation of 50. I don't know the reason why, whether there's somebody had a login. I'm sure we'll better it next time. I also like to thank Sangeeta and Lalit, our co-founder and director, for helping us and supporting us back end for this and many more other award events. And our team, Mr. Swami, Rupesh, Pavitra, Neeraj and team making it possible with all the creatives working with doctors, working with many other possible things day and night. Finally, it was very successful. And last but not the least, thanks for all those participants who have registered and participated, spent their valuable time to this valuable session. So next event is on 9th. As we told, this is a care for rare is not an event. It is a continuous process and never ending. And similarly, our webinar, it is not an event, it is a series. The next event is coming on 9th from Dr. Shubhamangala Acharya, an Ayurvedic specialist who will talk about home remedies for well-being under this COVID situation, which is very much required. So I look forward to you and all the participants' support in future as we go in days to come to make this Care for Air webinar series successful. Thank you so much.